right, welcome everybody. You ready to enjoy the unofficial closing ceremonies of the unofficial DerbyCon SecurityCon? So this is going to be a bit of an interesting discussion. It's a different presentation than we've used to having at most security conference talks. This is going to be a retrospective, and it's one that I feel really privileged in joining you all in. It's a retrospective because this year puts a bow on the wonderful thing that is DerbyCon. DerbyCon has changed the lives of thousands of people, and I know for a fact that each year that I've come has made me a better person. In 2010, Dave and Winfang went to Vegas with a message. PowerShell, oh my God. It's amazing. This was, for all intents and purposes, DerbyCon 0. This was a slide from their talk introducing DerbyCon 1, which is upcoming. In the 9 years since, DerbyCon has become the unofficial PowerShell security conference. And as the good parts of this industry have become aware of PowerShell's novelty, so have the bad. This has been a very interesting decade. So as a fitting close to the unofficial PowerShell security conference, we're going to take a journey and look back from the inside. You've all seen all the stuff from the outside, but we're going to take a look back from the inside. You're going to find out about when we laughed, when we cried, and we got a chance to share some high fives. That rhymed. But this is not only a retrospective. There are three main themes that I think have made the underpinnings of this amazing time. And these things give me hope for the future. Optimism wins, be open, and enjoy the journey. You probably don't recognize this guy, but you might in 30 years. This is my dad. By the way, when I asked him if I could include OPSEC and stuff, if I could include a picture of him in a conference, he's like, yeah, sure. And he sends me this. So when I was a kid, I got seriously interested in computers. At some point, my dad's work let him take out an interest-free loan on what at the time was a very, very expensive personal computer. So I started getting interested in bulletin boards. And my dad, wanting to support my interest in computers, we had an agreement. I could run the bulletin board from 9 p.m. until 7 a.m. I was thinking about it this week, like, I've never seen my daughter wake up at 7 a.m., but whatever. I did with enough time to turn it all down. We'd get the occasional stray call, but it all worked out. Bulletin boards are what got me interested in security. You had this strange new world of bulletin boards, all these kind of people exploring the magic and the edge cases in what we knew at that time were these new things called computers. At one point, I remember talking to my dad about this cool thing I was learning about called batch files. So I tried to explain it, and he was having a hard time getting it. And, I was like, I don't know, maybe it's an age difference or something like that. But one thing I did know for a fact, he worked like crazy. He had an amazing work ethic, and he switched careers when he was like 50. One of the jobs he got was working maintenance at a community center. And so one of the first jobs he had at the community center was waxing the floors. And you've all seen what a gym floor in a community center looks like. It's, cloudy, bumpy, and thick. So he started just doing the best he could. And after a few months went by, he started sharing me pictures of these things. And they were just like perfect quality, TV quality basketball courts. He just took pride in everything he did. So he started the best he could and learned more from it every week. After a while after that, he got a job at Kentucky Fried Chicken. And again, he went in there and he was kind of shocked at how the kids were just really not keeping up with the quality that you would expect in a job like this. So he started doing everything he could. He started freshening the oils, making sure that the maintenance stuff was kept up on the right things. He started really following the very literal instructions that come from corporate office on how to cook chicken properly. And after a while of this, he started doing amazing things. So he would plan these big batches to arrive just in time for these big peak rushes. And he figured it out enough so that there was just enough chicken so that there wasn't a ton wasted at the end to now cause bad chicken for the next people. All of these people in all of these rushes had the best, freshest, crispest, juiciest chicken they had ever had. It was amazing. After that, he started working maintenance at a big university. And he started treating all those buildings at those universities like they were his second set of children. And one of the things he did as part of this was he just made sure that every time he went somewhere, he did one little thing. So he had to go from the tool shed to the dorms. He'd make sure if he saw a little sagging power faceplate somewhere down there, he'd tighten it up along the way. He had to go take out the garbage somewhere. Well, he'd replace a light bulb along the way. So after time went on about this, these things started being in clinically good shape. He could walk through the halls and push open a door with one finger because that's all it required to do its job right. Now, when it came to his intellectual curiosity, one thing he loved to do was scan books into his computer. So this was the early days of OCR, where you had to spend days swiping down every page, days correcting errors. But he did it, and when he was done, he had this folder full of these electronic documents, and he loved it. He said he could scan through and search through all of the stuff of all of his library, and it was like having the universe at his fingertips. He loved it. So anyways, this is the guy that I was having a hard time explaining batch files to. So it was very clear that the topic was a lot more complicated than I thought it was, and I wasn't a good enough communicator at that time to get the concepts through. So anyways, I kept up with computers. I took them through high school and university, which landed me at Microsoft. My first job was at Encarta. Oh man. You're like, I thought you'd be smarter by now. I thought I was going to be a genius, working on an encyclopedia all day. But the thing is, you work so much on like the code and the HTML that you just don't have those extra couple hours to spend reading encyclopedia articles all day. But I did gain one skill. I did work on the integration with the MSN homepage like all the time. So I became a leading expert on celebrity pop culture. Spoiler alert, he did. So see that login button at the top? That was the part that I mostly worked on. It was the login flows and all the stuff related to that infrastructure. We had, tons and tons of ASP.NET, XML. The whole encyclopedia was backed by XML. We had to write XSLT, which is this brutal language, to convert XML into HTML. It was a really interesting thing. And of course, in Encarta, there was a lot of operational duty, right? It was a website in the early days. And we ran Encarta on about 31 servers. You might be thinking, 31 servers, that sounds like amateur hour, doesn't it? So for some perspective, if you take a look at Stack Overflow in 2014, they ran their entire production workload on 8 servers. That's changed a little bit since then, but not by much. They're one of the top serving traffic websites in the world, and they handle it in, a dozen or so servers. It's a bit more with redundancy and whatever, but in terms of the core workload, it's pretty amazing how much you can do with little. And so we kind of dealt with these issues of doing a lot with a little in Encarta. So one of the things that Encarta had was this really interesting kind of camel hump shape of traffic. And so you'd have one hump at around 3 o'clock p.m., and that kind of makes sense. That's when all the kiddos are coming home from school, doing their homework, working on their encyclopedia. But then you had another one that was at like 10 a.m. Any idea why? Good guesses. It wasn't Europe. It wasn't lunch. This is when all the parents would come home after dropping off their kids, finally have some me time, and have the chance to read through the encyclopedia and learn about stuff that interested them. These were lifelong learners, and it's something that impresses me to this day. So balancing these two bimodal humps of traffic, it was a constant juggling act. We would do things like co-locate the version of the UK version with the Japanese version so that the humps would arrive at different times and all this kind of stuff. We could have, of course, put all of the content on all of the servers and had just hundreds and hundreds of more servers, because just the disk overhead of all that localized content would have just cost us so many servers. But we didn't. What we worked on was optimization, and this worked out really well. But in getting interested in automation, it was really clear to me that what I dreamt was automation at scale, and what I later realized was something more like the cloud. So, while I was at Encarta, there was this story on a website called Slashdot. And it was super cool. I was reading Slashdot, and it's like, hey, there's a new command shell coming out of Microsoft. And I was like, whoa, what a rumor. And I was like, hold on a second. I work at Microsoft. I don't have to just read Slashdot for rumors anymore. So I reached out internally at Microsoft, and I got a hold of this thing. And it was called Monad. And it was pretty cool. It was super rough at the time. It didn't have any commands to clear the screen. It had one help file, and that was, I'm pretty sure, was like copy and pasted from Wimic or something just to show that there could be help. But at the time, I saw how important this thing was going to be. Even at the very early stages, I realized this is a thing that was going to change the world. So I decided I need to join this team. And at Microsoft at the time, changing jobs used to be so scary. Things have changed in like incredibly good ways, but they used to be brutal. So for no real good reason, the system, the performance management system, was hyper competitive. So what would happen was all managers were forced to rank all of their employees in a stack from worst to best. This is going to sound brutal, and it's changed, and it was brutal. And what would happen is they had to force to allocate all of the rewards strictly according to that ranking. Reward the people at the top, and work on letting go the people at the bottom. Again, it's changed, but that was what it was like at the time. So if you were somebody that was looking for a new job and the manager knew, just think about how brutal this was. It was, of course, brutal on employees, but also think about the perverse incentive it puts on management. So if they knew somebody wasn't happy and was looking for a new job, of course what they're going to do is well, then that person is the worst, because the people who are staying are the ones that I want to keep on. So that made looking for new jobs really hard, but imagine it getting worse. At Microsoft, you had to ask permission before hiring for a new job. And so what you had to do, what people would do as a risk mitigation strategy, is they would say, can I have permission to interview? And they're like, this is basically my going away party. And then they would interview for dozens of jobs, because if just the hope that at least one of them will stick and they're not going to get totally smoked that next year. So Lee, not being a smart person but a passionate person, applied for one interview, got one job, and that was with the Monad team. So when I joined the team, at that point there was a security engineer who was just working on leaving the team. We were just starting to do some security work at the time, and then the team, knowing my security background, said, hey, do you want to do security for this new thing? And I was like, hell yeah, this is going to be awesome. So we focused on PowerShell security from the very, very beginning. because we knew that security was going to be important. We had seen the impact of things like Melissa and I love you, and I love you, and I love you. We had seen the impact of these things. So what we set out about to do was, from the outset, start to do some security functionality to work on limiting it. So we talked with the folks that did CMD, the folks that did VBScript, the folks that did software restriction policies in Windows. We, of course, looked at all of the security best practices in Unix. And what would happen is you talk to so many of these people and they'd go, what are you talking about? Like, once somebody gets root, it's game over. But we knew that we've seen the impact of these things. We couldn't accept that somebody getting root meant game over. We had to do something. Like, what would you do? So we invested anyways. We associated PowerShell scripts with Notepad so that people mistakenly double-clicking don't launch one. We associated PowerShell with the API in Windows that marks them as dangerous and untrusted. So for example, when you can't attach one of these things in Outlook, that's why it gets stripped. That's why it gets stripped from mail flows, all these kind of things. You knew that that API existed, right? Neither did most of Microsoft. We also worked on things like logging, right? Like, no other shell had really brought in logging. We brought in a bunch. Not as good as we made it, but we did bring in a bunch. Now, execution policies are like the great punching bag of Monad security. And I've realized since then that that was a very myopic view. So to realize what execution policies are all about, think about chmod on Unix. You're used to, you get a script, make it executable, run it. It's like good, and you forget it sometimes, and you're like, ugh, stupid, and you enable it. But what you can do is realize that, what if we could improve this a little bit by saying, if it's signed by a trusted publisher, well then let that thing run automatically. It's meant to be executable. So we took something that was a best practice in Unix and tried to make it something that was maybe a bit more usable on Windows. But what I realized in the years since, that this has been an even better security improvement than we even realized, because the folks that we laugh at that have done all signed execution policy thinking that they're a security control are way ahead of the field when it comes to implementing application whitelisting. They already know how to sign things. They probably have the idea of what a trusted image looks like. They're auditing these things. So all of the skills that somebody built, building what we're treating as a punching bag, has put them way ahead of the field. I think it's a really, really interesting perspective. So we just didn't accept that root meant game over. We had optimism that we could do something. And just when we were starting to feel proud of ourselves, we heard the early rumblings of the first Vista virus. So on August 4th, 2005, one of our MVPs let us know about this rumblings going around on the internet. The first Vista virus. And this thing was incredibly simple. You can basically see the code there. It was an MSH script that would append itself to the end of MSH scripts. And that's basically it. Like, okay, scripting language can manage text files like news at 11. But the thing is, Adam Barr, he was a security researcher, a security program manager that I worked with at the time. We realized that this was in Vista, which was newly in beta, and that was going to make news. So what we did is we went back and we put up a blog post, prepared a blog post about this virus, talking about all the security controls, what it really meant, that you had to explicitly pwn yourself before it could continue on, and we waited. We knew that this was going to be a big mark, black mark on PowerShell security if we did nothing about it. So sure enough, this hit Slashdot. So for any of you unfamiliar with Slashdot at the time, it was huge. So think Hacker News, but full of like rabidly anti-Microsoft people, full of a bunch of blowhards that like think they know. Actually, just think Hacker News. It's just fine. You get it. So sure enough, It hit Slashdot and the front page, no less. So we jumped on it, put up a comment right away that was like, hey, this happened. Here's a blog post talking about it. It got upvoted quickly. And it was amazing that the traditional anti-Microsoft rhetoric was surprisingly gone. People were able to read and have smart education. It felt good. So that day, that was a good day. Went home being like, save the world a little bit today. Slashdot was happy about Microsoft, like nothing else. But the following day was not. In perhaps the worst example of a Microsoft self-pwn I've ever seen, some folks tried to do damage control to protect the good name that was Windows Vista. The news cycle had already run its course, and it really ended up on a good note. They had pulled good quotes from my blog, and it really felt like things were done. But let's just say that didn't work out so well. This thing also hit the front page. The media storm caused by this self-pwn was just was stupid. It was years inside of Microsoft when I stopped hearing the term like, hey, wasn't Monad removed from Vista because it gets viruses? Like, it was so bad. But it was clear that what was starting to happen was that we had done such a good job at locking down the entry points of an attack that we were pretty happy with what was going on. So Monad officially shipped as Windows PowerShell in November of 2006. It first shipped as a part of the Windows SDK, like literally Windows SDK opt into PowerShell. It also then came as a standalone download, and then finally as a built-in component in Windows 7 in 2009. Funny thing about it being part of the Windows SDK, so it was a different team who put together the Windows SDK. And at some point we got a bug report that if you uninstalled the Windows SDK, PowerShell still stayed there. And so we reached out and asked them about it, and they kind of like blinked and they looked at us and they're like, why would anybody want to remove PowerShell? So my kind of team. So in around 2009 or 2010, attackers started coming in from the side. They would exploit something that was weaker. For example, a macro in a document that was packed into a zip file that was password protected or something like that. Or I kid you not, raw scripts being shared over the Kazaa file sharing network. Like, okay, I'm going to download something over peer-to-peer networking and double click it. All right. But Unix has always had this philosophy of like, no, duh, root, but we just had to move past that. These are real people sitting at real computers with real children and their dogs wrapped around their feet. We knew we had to do something. What would you do? So all of us here as security geeks, we've got a love for cool technology, cool tools, and fun new things. As a security person myself, I had marveled at the incredible use of PowerShell for just random security tooling. Like, this is an example of a ping sweep of a Class C network that finishes in 500 milliseconds. This is the kind of thing that you're used to seeing now at Carlos Perez's classes and stuff like that. But at the time, I had spent like 5 years wondering, why hasn't the rest of the world figured this out? Well, turns out in 2010, we finally got first contact. So we had a researcher reach out from a Fortune 1000 company, and he was deeply investigating an assume breach model of their appliance. If an attacker got in, they wanted to limit what they could do. They were doing stuff to harden their appliance that's really, really rare to see. We've been down this road a lot at Microsoft with Xbox, Azure Stack, Databox, Azure Sphere. But it's amazing to see other companies put this much effort into what most in the community today disparage as IoT. That researcher, you might recognize him. Hey Dave, you rock. It was great working with him. He was literally the first researcher into PowerShell. So there were a couple things that were off the mark. You know, when he reached out, there was a couple things we helped him out with a code review. And to be honest, there were some harsh words that were shared. Bind shell in CMD instead of PowerShell, you asshole. But the message of his talk was 100% true. This is the Dave that we all know and love, and I just didn't know it at the time. There's nothing you can do about a sufficiently powerful tool, and you can't control what somebody's going to do when they wield it. So rather than going down the unfortunate industry standard of trying to squash the research, we listened. We welcomed it. His talk happened, you've all seen it, it was awesome. At Microsoft at this time, that was Big Dave. Big Dave. At Microsoft at the time, we were very, very busy working on Windows 8. Security-wise, a huge feature of security at the time was Windows on ARM, also known as Windows RT. This was the goal of offering a Microsoft device that was a much more media and app-focused thing. So it was super locked down, and that was it. The picture you see at the bottom right there, that's the first time that PowerShell ever booted on the ARM architecture. That was magic. So security-wise, this brought in some really awesome features, like Device Guard, which is a Windows-wide API that any application can query to figure out the current system lockdown mode, and also determine the trust level of any file in the system. It also brought in constrained language, a version of the PowerShell language that made sure that only trusted scripts could run the kind of APIs like .NET scripting and things like that we were seeing attackers become increasingly fond of. So despite Windows RT being relatively short-lived, the security features that we added to Windows and PowerShell at the time, they live on and they help protect some seriously high security systems. So starting around early 2013, we started to see an uptick of PowerShell being used for malice. Attacks weren't coming through the front door because we had locked all that stuff down. But also, we were seeing that internal red teams like Office 365 had been investigating PowerShell as a post-exploitation vehicle for a little while. So Jeffrey and I, we started putting our heads together. While you can't force a powerful tool to be used only how you want it to be used, you can be absolutely sure that you're tilting the playing field on behalf of defenders. We first called this work the PowerShell slime trail. And I realized, kind of an attacker leaves a trail of slime wherever they go. It's a fun term. What I realized later was the term of security transparency really, really highlighted the work we were trying to do a lot more effectively. And a lot more presentations started coming. Started exploring the crazy power of this baby we built. And it was kind of feeling like it was getting harder every day. But we did, we kept on listening. And it was those days we realized how genuinely good the core of this community is. I've had many discussions with many of you, and I feel truly fortunate that some real and long-lasting friendships have formed. So seeing these attacks, and we started analyzing the core of what made them tick. And so we started working on features to not only mitigate them, but turn them into an advantage for the blue team. If an attacker is going to use PowerShell, let's make them regret it. In March of 2014, we checked in the first stages of PowerShell transparency. This is what a check-in mail looks like on the team at the time. Look at all that nice blue console colors, it's fun. Over the next 6 months, we continued to continually refine and work on the feature, add additional features, refine the functionality. Getting the core PowerShell stuff was pretty much straight engineering. It was challenging engineering, but straight engineering once we knew what we wanted to do. There were other things that we added, like AMSI, the anti-malware scan interface, which required a lot more engagement across all of Microsoft. That was working with Windows, Defender, the VB script team, PowerShell, of course. It felt like doing like a continuous walking tour of all of Microsoft. Somewhat coincidentally, many of the finishing touches of the Slime Trail and PowerShell transparency were getting polished off at the very, very same time as DerbyCon 4. And then the skids started coming. I want to talk to you about emotionally the lowest I've been in my professional career. On April 9th, 2014, word started going around about Poshcoder. So this was a new kind of ransomware. Like most, it started with macros and stuff like that. But unlike most, it used PowerShell as its delivery vehicle for the actual encryption. So the news was really, really sparse and scarce at the time, but there was this one forum on Bleeping Computer that was active. The folks there had discovered it, and they had done so much work investigating it. It went on for pages and pages. And I read every single one. And one of them stopped my heart. It's hard to explain how this felt. We had spent the last decade and tens of millions of dollars making a tool to make people's lives better. I can't count the number of people that have come out and said PowerShell's made their life better, or that got them a promotion, or that changed their business, or that literally changed their life for the better. But that day and the days that followed it, I really wish I could rewind time. I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I did. I just did. Like, nobody blames the inventors of the C programming language for being responsible for almost 100% of the malware out there. And they've never done anything to do anything about it. The seminal book on the most influential programming language of our time mentions the word security once. And it's a coincidence. I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I did, and it's a bitter pill that, as you can tell, still hits me to this day. On June 9th, 2015, we published a huge milestone in the journey of PowerShell security. PowerShell loves the blue team. In it, we were able to describe in amazing detail all of the amazing work we've been doing for almost 2 years. Script block logging, protected event logging, constrained language mode, automatic transcription. We didn't try to squash any of this research, we listened. All we could do is be honest. Yes, the environment out there is hostile, and here's what we've done about it. You can't control what somebody will do with a sufficiently powerful tool, but you can be 100% sure that you're placing the blue team on equal footing. For some perspective, you've probably seen CVEs issued as part of Windows updates about, PowerShell vulnerabilities and stuff. But what most don't realize that almost 100% of these are in a feature that isn't a traditional security boundary. These are things that we're patching in things like security transparency, which literally no other shell or runtime out there has. And I've got to say, hats off to the folks at SpectreOps. Lee and Will are upstairs right now giving a talk. SpectreOps folks are supporting them. They've been a great, great partner in this journey, and many, many of these findings are because of them, and they've been great partners. The same day that we published PowerShell Loves the Blue Team, we also published a major related infrastructure investment we made in Windows, the new AMSI interface. And this is something that is open to all applications and all antivirus vendors. What other operating system has an API that any application can call into to determine if dynamic content is still safe, and that any antivirus vendor can listen to and use to enrich their data. At DerbyCon 5 in 2015, I got the chance to start talking about some of these awesome challenges and these changes and these defensive improvements. I also submitted talks about these to Black Hat and DEF CON, neither of which were accepted. This is just another example of DerbyCon being way ahead of the field. The next year, DerbyCon 6 in 2016. The looming impact of security transparency in PowerShell was starting to become clear. Jeffrey and I were honored to give DerbyCon's keynote that year with the theme of collaboration, the future, and us. It's hard to overstate how important collaboration has been in this incredible journey. Microsoft has a lot of passion in this specific area, but this kind of interaction is exactly the kind of culture that I value the most about this part of the InfoSec community. I consider it a rare and unique pleasure to be part of a company that can care this deeply about security and then also participate with the community so authentically and as part of the community. Want to do a little bit of audience participation here. Hands up and keep them up. If you have submitted a security concern about PowerShell to us, please raise your hand. If you've submitted a CVE or a MSRC case to us, please raise your hand. If you've blogged about PowerShell security best practices, please raise your hand. If you've tweeted to help customers understand the impact of security, please raise your hand. If you've helped people in your company understand the impact of security and how to secure it more, please raise your hand. Shit. You guys are amazing. You are what makes this industry tick. Thank you. Also that year, one of the presentations blew my mind. Nick Carr and Matt Dunwoody presented on No Easy Breach. For me, this was incredible. They were doing incident response at a company with 100,000 servers. 10 of these per day were getting popped. So like really in your head, try to think about that as a defender. If you knew that one of these servers that had just been popped, and you knew this was literally nation state APT. If you knew that one of these servers had been popped, and it's your job to extract the tools, the techniques, the processes, where are they going next? What does this mean? Like, I don't know how you get out of this without a week of forensics on a machine. For most things at this scale, you're talking about a team of full-time 70 people just to keep up. I don't know if you got more cash than I do, but that's going to be a hard time. But because Nick and Matt had heard about PowerShell security transparency, they did one thing. They upgraded the version of PowerShell across the environment, turned on all the logging, and guess what? This turned the entire toolchain into an open source investigation. Attackers had been using Python, batch files, PowerShell, you name it, anything that's on the machine. But because of this security transparency, they were able to extract everything that they were doing just because of this one tool, as long as they were using PowerShell. That finally broke open the case, and they were able to remediate the environment and save the customers. It's just incredible what security transparency can do. That year, we also introduced Just Enough Administration, just an amazing foundational technology that lets you give people access to manage aspects of sensitive servers without having them access the entire sensitive servers themselves. So that's been a long time that DerbyCon's been aware of this stuff. But meanwhile, the rest of the world was starting to catch on. DEF CON 24 was like music to my ears. I attended probably half a dozen presentations calling out the quickly dwindling utility of PowerShell as a post-exploitation language. Still, no talks from the PowerShell team. We tried. But people were starting to really point out what the DerbyCon crowd had been realizing all along. And then 2017 rolled around, and I guess you could call it a case of be careful what you wish for. For some time, I had been chiding Daniel Bohannon, Debo, on invoke obfuscation. Yeah, he's a good guy, but that's not good. Invoke obfuscation, so here's the background. Invoke obfuscation pointed out a danger that Mandiant was seeing every single day remediating actual customers. They were seeing the fact that obfuscated signatures were just ripping through the defenses that people had written because they weren't aware of the capabilities of obfuscated PowerShell. My only issue is that he was right. He was right, and the industry did not have the right amount of defensive tooling to make this change. So one interesting fact, so most antivirus that uses AMSI has a pretty good handle on invoke obfuscation code. But the issue is that there's a bunch of anti-malware engines out there that haven't yet understood how to use AMSI data stream. And this is honestly a time for some real talk with your antivirus vendors. If they're not listening to the AMSI data stream, then their lack of interest is causing you real actual risk. So we set out to make a toolkit that, based on the kind of a bare minimum of being able to collect event logs from Windows, could help you detect obfuscated code at scale. It turns out that PowerShell is pretty freaking awesome for blue team tools. Who would have known, right? We did a ton of work and artisanally handled revoke obfuscation later that year. So that year I also realized I needed to do a bunch of work to summarize a bunch of this incredible security work into something more all-encompassing. So I put together defending against PowerShell attacks, and in somewhat of a curse of fortune, had 2 talks accepted at Black Hat, 2 at DEF CON, 2 at DerbyCon, Microsoft's Blue Hat, and an internal Microsoft machine learning conference. That was kind of harsh. So it turns out there is a way to get a defensive talk into DEF CON. Just submit a talk about offense. That's all you gotta do. But then spend 90% of the time talking about how to defend. You gotta do what you gotta do, right? Hack all the things. Presenting with Debo at Black Hat was funny. At Black Hat, you know, the cameraman kept on trying to pan between us during our back and forth, and since he's this huge gladiator guy, the cameraman kept on whizzing right over my head, or doing slow dramatic pans right at his beard. But looking back, it really is amazing what security transparency can do. And one view that I've thought has always been really useful to put this in context is MITRE. This is just one way to catalog the different components of an attack, but I think it's a useful one. PowerShell is, of course, a potential component of an attack. But since the beginning, hearing about PowerShell being used for malice, we invested a ton in security features that nobody else has. And another thing is we at Microsoft started investing a ton into these security signals. So in December of 2018, MITRE evaluated several EDR solutions by mapping techniques from APT3, which is Boron, into the MITRE attack framework. Defender ATP, which is Microsoft's solution, did very, very well. To start, ATP crushed it at the scripting category. Just a perfect example of being aware of security transparency, and I'm proud of that. But that's not what makes me the proudest. What makes me the proudest is that when you dig into all of the categories unrelated to PowerShell, the attack framework lit up like a Christmas tree. frequently due to its PowerShell intelligence. So of the 54 attack categories that were evaluated by this set, fully 36 of them benefited from this PowerShell security transparency. I manually reviewed every single one of them, and if the attacker had limited themselves to Python or Perl or VBScript or something else, the story might have been a little bit different, but they didn't, and they fell right into the honeypot that we've been building over the past couple years. I really love the way that Chris Thompson from IBM's X-Force Red put this at DEF CON 25. When PowerShell first came out, Red Teamers started to herald it as the best thing ever to happen in pen testing. But only 3 years after the first check-in of PowerShell security transparency, the tune had changed completely. Now, I want to reflect back on that grief I felt when that one guy in that one forum lost all of his family photos to ransomware. Once AMSI started to come out, I started to feel a new sense of hope. Defender already has dozens of techniques to detect capabilities and behavior, whether something is malicious. But until the advent of AMSI, applications were unable to collaborate with antivirus to evaluate the safety of dynamic content. After AMSI came out, we started to see it block malware that would have otherwise succeeded. Slowly at first, but each one matters. Each detection represents a person that's still going to have their photos. It's a person who is not going to have their accounts drained by a banking Trojan. These represent real people. I took a look before coming to DerbyCon, and AMSI-based detections are blocking, and they're blocking a lot. It's just such an inspiring graph. But what gives me hope and gives me faith in the power of the defensive side of this industry is the scale. I did some legwork so that I could share this with you. 10 million of these encounters per month are being blocked by AMSI. Not just in PowerShell, in .NET, who has implemented AMSI, in Office, 10 million people not becoming part of a botnet, 10 million people with their precious memories and documents. This is your family, this is my family. They're looking at the retirement nest eggs because they're still there. And this is just Defender. AMSI is an open Windows interface that any security vendor can opt into, and many have chosen. So this number is even higher. It's just incredible. So I wanted to close up talking back about my dad. It turns out that it wasn't our age difference that was causing him to have a hard time understanding batch files, but I only found out later exactly why. Well, that database of his, it kept on growing. He put my book into it. He got it off of BitTorrent, but he now loves PowerShell, and he's one of the most advanced users of regular expressions I've ever met. He uses it to parse gigabytes of XML, to do word frequency analysis, clustering, grouping, Lucene indexed searches, part of speech tagging with the Brill tagger, information extraction, and anything else he can imagine. In just a few seconds, he's able to search all of Wikipedia with a fidelity that you just cannot get from a general purpose search engine like Bing, Google, or even Wikipedia. He retired years ago, but he's still exploring every day. He's one of these lifelong learners. And that's what gives me hope. When we work together as a community, as defenders of both the red team and the blue team variety, it's our turf and we can set the rules. When we work together, we can return technology to the people that deserve it. Thank you.